before listening to this sermon, you should please read Exodus chapter 17 and chapter 18. Title this sermon, The God Who Leads via Leaders. Now, in science fiction, whenever aliens visit Earth, what is the first question that they always ask? Take me to your leader. The first thing all aliens do is ask directions to the man or woman in charge. If an alien visited Earth tomorrow and asked, "Take me to your leader," what observations would you make? Are our leaders logical, like Spock from Star Trek? Well, Donald Trump proves that the best of men are not always logical. Are our leaders sacrificial, like Captain Kirk, a man who so often sacrificed his life for the sake of others? Well, many governments are led by self-serving men whose only interest is money, fame, and power. Are our leaders like Luke Skywalker, people who we can place our hopes in? Well, hopes are often raised whenever a new leader is elected, but how often do leaders bring about radical change for the better? The direction of all visiting aliens is to seek out the best of men. The observation of all aliens visiting planet Earth is that the best of men are men at best. The solution? Destroy all leaders? In sci-fi movies, that's generally what the aliens go on to do. Kill all the leaders. And if we're honest, this option seems rather appealing. Get rid of all forms of leadership and the world would be a better place. But would the world really be better if each one of us were left to our own devices? Would we naturally head in the right direction and do the right thing? Probably not. Children need the leadership of parents. Societies generally and sincerely want governments that promote justice and law. Christians often look to church leaders for wisdom, help, and advice. God has given us parents, authorities, church leaders to help lead us. What matters is the direction they are leading us in, good or bad. So, that's what we're going to look at this morning. Direction, observation, and solution. So first of all, direction. Now, whenever you're on a journey, you look for signposts to help direct you. You might see a sign that says 10 miles to Yorkshire, followed by 5 miles to Yorkshire, followed by a sign that says welcome to Yorkshire. When you reach the sign that says welcome to Yorkshire, do you stop? Do you get out of the car and spend your day trip looking at the sign? No, the purpose of a sign is to point you in the direction of something else. And the role of all God-appointed leaders is the same. The role of church leaders is to point people in God's direction. The role of Moses was to point people in God's direction as well. And yet we find in chapter 17 that the Israelites got out of the car and started looking at the sign. In verse 2 we read that the Israelites quarrelled with Moses. Moses replies by asking, "Why do you quarrel with me?" In verse 3, they continue grumbling against Moses and question why he, Moses, brought them out of Egypt. In verse 4, Moses cries out to God, telling God that the people are almost ready to stone me. You know, Moses' job was to point people in the direction of God, but the people kept on looking in his direction instead. The Israelites looked to Moses for what only God could give. And in the 21st century, our error is the same. So I'm going to speak generally about some general errors that we need to avoid. Looking to men for what only God can give. So we might look to leaders for approval. We might want our leaders to see the good things that we are doing so that we feel better about ourselves. Then we might feel disappointed if they don't notice, or if all they give us is a single thanks. The reality is, we should only do things for an audience of one, God. The only person we should be seeking to please is God Himself. Or we might look to leaders for assurance. We might seek out a Christian leader for assurance that our sins are forgiven. Or we might seek out their prophetic predictions about the future. Whereas in reality, God is the only one who can forgive our sin. And only God knows the future. We should be looking to God for these type of assurances. We shouldn't be looking to men. Or we might look to leaders for revelation. Now God has given us church leaders to help point us to God's revelation, that is the Bible, and explain what it says. But sometimes we can be more interested in hearing the words of men, entertaining words, profound words, words which we wouldn't have heard anywhere else. We want leaders who bring us these types of messages, whereas all we should be interested in is leaders who correctly handle the Word of God. Is there a place for Christian leaders, both globally, nationally, and in a local church? Yes. Yorkshire needs signs that point to Yorkshire. Israel needed Moses as a mediator between the people and God. God has given us Christian leaders to help direct us. But all signposts are signposts and nothing more. Signposts to point us to God. Now Moses, he was a brilliant signpost. Firstly, he doesn't call his son Moses Jr., which he quite easily could have done. Instead, the name of his second son is yet another signpost to God. We read in verse 4 that Moses' second son was named Eliezer, for he said, "My father's God was my helper. He saved me from the sword of Pharaoh." You know, Moses took great delight in pointing people in God's direction, even through the meaning of his son's name. And secondly, even though Moses' father-in-law came to visit him, asking about his welfare, Moses didn't even mention himself once. It's amazing that 12 times in chapter 18 we read that Jethro is Moses' father-in-law. Jethro is Moses' father-in-law. Jethro is Moses' father-in-law. 12 times Jethro is described as Moses' father-in-law. And so Jethro is presumably very interested in Moses. And presumably Moses is very interested in what Jethro thinks of him. And verse 7 and 8 of chapter 18. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law. Later on, Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done. And later, and about all the hardships they had met along the way, and how the Lord had saved them. There's no mention of Moses' staff, Moses' actions, or Moses' words. There was no mention of these things that helped lead the people out of Egypt. Why? Because a leader's job is to point people in God's direction, not their direction. Verses 9 to 12. Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel. He said, "Praise be to the Lord. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods." Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. Moses was a signpost that led people to God and pointed people to God. When church leaders or Christian authors or online preachers that you listen to, when they point you to God, pay attention. It's always good to be pointed in God's direction. But beware, whenever you look to leaders for what only God can give, you will observe that even the best of men are men at best. Observation, that's what we're coming on to. Observation, that the best of men are men at best. Now, the fictional TV program called Servant of the People, it follows an ordinary man who unexpectedly becomes the president of the Ukraine. Despite being an ordinary man, this ordinary man does a really good job. He promises to deal with corruption and to bring about reform. And in this fictional program, he succeeds. He follows through on his promises and he becomes the Messiah of the Ukraine. But sadly, this feel-good TV program had to end. Why? Well, the reason it had to end was because the actor who played the part of the president in the TV program, he actually became president in real life. Vladimir Zelensky is now currently the president of the Ukraine. People voted for him because his fictional TV program actually made people believe that he was the Messiah that the Ukraine needed. He was only an actor who then went on to become the president. Now, even if Vladimir tries his best and is entirely sincere, do you think his real-life presidency will go as well? Do you think we'll observe him fulfill all his promises and bring about such radical reform? Well, probably not. For though it's very easy to portray a person as a type of Messiah in the fictional world, most often in life, humans let us down. Moses, who wrote the book of Exodus, clearly wanted us to portray this reality. The reality that even the best of men are men at best. In verse 9, Moses says, "Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill." But by verse 12, Moses is weary and having to sit down. In verse 11, Moses raised his hands, and it appears that the raising of his hands is the key to victory. But in verse 12, we're corrected. Victory only came because of Moses, Aaron, and Hur's hands all worked together. In verse 14, God tells Moses to write a record of this victory for Joshua to read. Joshua was going to be the leader who would later succeed and replace Moses. In verse 15, Moses gives all the credit for this victory to God. God is always the source of any leader's positive contribution. Both God and Moses wanted us to observe that in the real world, the best of men are men at best. So, why do we, thousands of years later, need reminding of this fact? Well, in the TV program Servant of the People, it was very easy for Vladimir Zelensky to portray himself as the perfect president. However, if the Ukraine expect Vladimir to be the perfect president in real life, well, they'll be vastly disappointed. No Mr. Perfect actually exists. In much the same way, you can spend forever looking for a perfect church with the perfect pastor. If you do that, you'll spend a long time looking. And then, when you think you've found the church or that leader, you'll place your faith in them, only for them to let you down. Many people hop from church to church looking for such a perfect church or a perfect church leadership. Some people leave churches forever because a church leader has proved to be imperfect. But though it really does grieve God when the best of men do the worst of things, we need to remember that our faith is in God and not in men. God will never disappoint you, whereas men in leadership always will. So don't forever be on the search for Mr. Perfect, and don't be disappointed when you discover Mr. Average either. Despite us admiring Moses as a man of great faith, Moses, who wrote Exodus, is keen to remind us that he is just an average man. He was not a gifted speaker. His best asset was an inanimate stick, and he shared the same weaknesses as all men. That's why he needed the likes of Aaron and Hur to prop him up. If Moses came to your church and applied for the job and said, "I'm not a gifted speaker, the only quality I have is an inanimate stick, and I'm pretty weak like all of the men," chances are, if he came and applied for a job of a pastor, he'd get turned away. Nowadays, because of the internet and books, we have the chance to access Mr. Above Average. And I'd be the first person to say thank you sincerely to God for being able to access material produced by the likes of Tim Keller and Martin Lloyd-Jones, people with an above average giftedness in explaining the Bible and applying it to our lives. I'm very grateful to such men. But something I've also discovered, that God's word often impacts me the most when I access the teaching of Mr. Average, who runs an average church somewhere else. Though God has a place and a plan for Mr. Above Average, the New Testament seems to suggest that God's plan and God's way is to use average people who are part of normal local churches to build up and bless his people. So don't be disappointed if Mr. Average stands up in your pulpit. So a last observation before we move on to a solution. Well, the first mention of Joshua in the Bible comes in the same passage in which we observe Moses' weaknesses. Joshua was the man who was going to replace Moses as leader. Now, one clear reason Moses recorded these events was to remind Joshua that success depends on God alone. Every leader needs reminding of that fact. Success depends on God alone. But since most people reading Exodus and listening to this sermon are probably not leaders, there may have been some other point in mentioning Moses' weaknesses. Point 1. More than one leader was needed. Moses needed Aaron and Hur, and when Moses died, somebody needed to replace him. Attachment to one leader alone is dangerous. No leader is the Messiah, and no leader has the monopoly on truth. Also, more than one leader is good to help make up for the failings of the other. It's so much better when you have different personalities teaching from the same Bible. Any extremes one Mr. Average A is prone to can often be rectified by listening to Mr. Average B. Another point, God's work will always continue when one leader moves on. We need to remember that God's work will always continue when one leader moves on. For example, if you're listening to this and you're a member of North Shields Evangelical Church, well, tomorrow I might get knocked off my bike and Ronnie might fall down a manhole. I really hope that doesn't happen. Ronnie, please don't fall down a manhole anytime soon. We don't want that to happen. But it might happen. You never know. But it's a great reminder that God's work will always continue when one leader moves on. Despite weaknesses, God can use anyone he wants. And I was just using church leadership as an example. I can refer to any job in church. Sunday school, or on being on the door, or welcoming people, being a friend to someone. God, when one man goes, or when one woman goes, it's reassuring to know that God can use the next person that he has in line. And thirdly and lastly, solution. After observing the fallen leaders of Earth, most aliens decide to wipe out all leaders with their sonic lasers. But though this might make great movies, getting rid of all leaders is not God's solution. Despite chapter 17 pointing out Moses' weaknesses, the moment Jethro observes Moses' weaknesses for himself, Jethro goes on to appoint hundreds more leaders, hundreds more weak and imperfect Mr. Averages. Now this is not the solution they were expecting. If all men are men at best, why appoint more men to the positions of leadership? Well, in the sci-fi cartoon called Futurama, there's a race of aliens called the Neutral People, who live on the neutral planet. These bald, grey-skinned aliens are led by leaders who are entirely neutral and incapable of making any decisions. Their motto for the people is, live free or don't. In other words, make your own decisions. In times when the people need leadership, the leaders reply, all I know is my gut says, maybe. When danger is on the horizon, the neutral leaders announce beige alert, not red alert, beige alert. And when the president of the neutral president is about to die, he responds, if I don't survive, tell my wife, hello. Now these leaders don't lead. They're passionate about nothing. What we need is not passionless leaders or no leaders. What we need are leaders who are passionate about the right thing. Verse 18, Jethro said to Moses, the work, that is the work of leadership, is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them his decrees and instructions, and show them the way that they are to live, and how they are to behave. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Jethro's solution, which is actually God's solution. God's solution to the weaknesses of men is to appoint more leaders who are passionate about the right thing. Men who fear God. Not men who only tell you what you want to hear because they fear men. Not men who prefer to cut bits out of the Bible and tell you their opinions because they don't fear or revere God. We need to listen to leaders who fear God alone. Leaders who fear God and who are trustworthy. Not men who have one set of standards for the people they preach to and another set of standards for themselves. Not men who use their power abusively. We need trustworthy men who are willing to strive for holiness in their own lives. Men who hate dishonest gain. Not men who become popular because they feed you sloppy, sentimental stuff that will make you like them and call them nice. Not men whose main interest is how much you pay them. We need to listen to men of sincere motives, whose main aim is to build God's kingdom and not their own kingdom. So in summary, direction. Don't look to leaders for approval or for assurance or new revelation. Look instead to leaders who direct you to God and to His Word. Observation. Accept that the best of men are men at best. Be thankful that God can use Mr. Average A with the help and assistance of Mr. Average B and Mr. Average C and Mrs. Average D. Solution. Seek out leaders who are passionate about this right thing. And that one thing is God.